She's got the mic again, girlies.
Actually, screw the mic, it was getting kind of fidgety. It's more of a sit at the desk kind of tool. Before I begin, I think the reason why I chose to engage with a particularly damaging aspect of something I hold dear is because I'd like to continue to hold it dear. TV shows, especially off-the-air TV shows, are not people. They cannot learn, they cannot change, and characters that die will always die because writers can only take them as far as they can before they need to write a finale. Shows from the early 2000s are aging poorly, or at very least aging weird. There are definitely things said on this show that make me cringe and make me think that it would absolutely cancel a person if they were said now. And I also recognize that there are some viewpoints in it that no longer align with today's society almost 10 years after its inception and after its end. But I still love it. And I'd like to start the analysis from a place of love. House M.D. premiered on Fox on November 16th, 2004. I would have just turned 7 years old, and it was about this point in my life that all my teachers and the adults in my life started to notice I was falling behind and needed to start figuring out what was wrong with me. So I was starting to be observed by school employees, my teacher, my parents, to find out if I had an auditory processing disorder, if I needed glasses. Was I not trying particularly hard? However, this isn't really what I associate with the early seasons of House. When I think of the early seasons of House, interestingly, what I think about is the light. House takes place in Plainsboro, New Jersey, which is not a part of New England where I live, but it's close enough. Obviously, the show is shot in Los Angeles on a lot, very rarely going on any location that feels distinctly East Coast, but the establishing shots, they capture something about the fall and winter light, especially the winter light, that immediately transports me back to childhood. Also, the weird oversaturation of the first episode where everything had this almost orange glow to it made me remember the tungsten-colored lamps from when I was a kid, different than the sharper LEDs of today. But I can't just like the show for aesthetics, right? There has to be something of substance. Cut to 6 years later when I'm 13 years old and I'm home alone for the evening. Now, to younger viewers, this may be an unfamiliar concept to you, but this was the period of time with DVR where if you wanted to record something, it had to tune to the channel that it was recording. So even if you were watching something that was already previously taped on your DVR, it would still kick you out of that to tape whatever it was trying to tape at that particular time, which is what happened to me. I was home alone one evening. I was going through my parents' CD cabinet looking for Broadway cast recordings I hadn't heard yet, like you do, watching a taped episode of Glee, because I think it was still in its first season at the time. And eventually the DVR, after several warnings, kicked me out and tuned to Fox for the primetime taping of House. And by this point, I had only watched television for like kids and tweens. So Disney Channel, cartoons, iCarly, anything on Nickelodeon, and Glee. That was really it. I didn't think there would be anything interesting for me on adult TV. It all looked bland in comparison. I did not think I would be interested in anything on this like grown-up show, which I didn't even know was about doctors at the time. The show was called House. I thought it was about a house. Don't know what the house was full of, but I thought it was about a place. The episode in question was the season 7 masterpiece called Unplanned Parenthood, in which House and his best and only friend Wilson are tasked with taking care of Dr. Lisa Cuddy, House's then girlfriend, and both of their boss's adopted daughter. The two are hilariously underprepared for this task and are quickly panicked when they think that the child might have swallowed a dime, so they have to sneak her into the hospital without Cuddy knowing and try to find out if she's in any kind of danger. They're completely inept, hijinks ensue, you get incredible moments like these.
You're telling me to do the right thing while climbing out a window!
Open? Ba 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 ba. Ba ba ba. Open?
Oh. And 13-year-old me was appeased. These two grown men acting like children had pleased me, and then I promptly forgot about it for at least another 2 years. I truthfully pin my love of this show on my dad. My sibling and I both joke that if House and Wilson were to have a baby, you would get our dad, because he exhibits qualities of both. And he's the reason why I saw the whole season in its entirety in the first place, because he was the one who was watching it, he was the one who was taping it. It was a random winter afternoon. I was at the performing arts school, so my weekdays were usually about 12 hours long. Like from ages 14 to 15, I was getting up at 5 a.m. and not getting home until at least dinner time. So weekends, needless to say, I slept in. By this point, I had just kind of started to become a bit cynical as a person and as a teenager. I'd been diagnosed with ADHD at this point. My parents had gotten divorced. I was feeling kind of alienated from my peers. Also, performing arts programs are not super conducive to developing healthy relationships or even just healthy development sometimes. And I was starting to see through some of the BS, and people really don't like it when you call it out. So, wasn't having a great time, but my dad wakes me out of a dead sleep one morning, excitedly telling me, come downstairs and watch this episode with me. It's like that show Sherlock, which we had started watching the year before. The episode was another season 7 episode called Two Stories, in which House is in a school principal's office with 2 other children, and they all give conflicting accounts as to how the other ended up there. And seeing that episode first, that strays from formula and lets me get to know the characters first before actually introducing me to the concept of the show, similar to Unplanned Parenthood, which really didn't run in formula either, helped endear me to these characters more. This guy was sharp, he was funny, he didn't censor himself, and it was framed as cool. And as someone who did not get met with positive energy when she said what she thought, this was enticing to me. Also, the loner genius trope that House falls into is something I've always been a fan of. My sibling was also up by this point, and the Oxygen Network was airing a marathon that day. So we got through like another couple episodes before we all just collectively decided to find it on streaming and start from the beginning. So I immediately latched on to various things. But as someone who did this a couple months ago, how do I reconcile my love for the show with this?
You know that close to 1% of the population identifies as asexual?
You really gotta get you laid.
I have a patient who's asexual.
Is she a giant pool of algae?
I remembered this episode shortly after I worked out my aceness, and I remembered it wasn't particularly great. It's also in the final season of the show, which I tend to watch sparingly, not just for that episode, but for like other gut punch moments I tend to save for once in a while. Recently, I began watching David J. Bradley's videos on the Arrow Ace spectrum, including the one on Company, which I adored, and the one on Sherlock Holmes, which I also adored. It was also repeatedly suggested through the algorithm, his most popular video, the episode where House cured asexuality, and I avoided it like the plague. I knew it was bad. I knew the episode sucked, and it was a major grievance in the fandom and in the ace community. Look, no one likes their favorite thing getting picked apart. I mean, I watched the Harry Potter fandom go through a reckoning the past 2 years, and I wasn't even a fan of that. But I understand that it must be painful to have something that was so formative to your younger years get tainted in that way, and you're stuck with how to move forward. Recently, I watched Broe Deschanel's video on Sex and the City, and how she reconciles all of the cringeworthy moments with this deep love she has for the series, a series she's watched about 5 times. And the way she described her relationship with that show is how I would describe my relationship with the show House. And in that video, she introduced me to the idea of a paranoid reading versus a reparative reading, which really boils down to this. A paranoid reading is about emphasizing the negative and seeking out the problematic elements of a piece of media or a piece of text, and the purpose is to expose and leave no room for growth. This is usually like what hate watching is, like things like that. A reparative reading is allowing yourself to gain as much pleasure as you can out of a piece of media that holds both pain and pleasure, and allowing yourself to imagine a utopian version of said work while also not negating the pain that comes with it. And then I realized I'd kind of been doing this by accident for the last 8 years. In 2014, for fun, I started messing around in my head with the idea of a House reboot, but with a female lead, trying to see how much I could keep the same and how much I would have to change. And this would go so far as swapping genders of other characters, cutting lines because they just wouldn't make sense coming from a female character. But the character of House I wanted to keep as similar to the original as possible, because females are not allowed to act like that in a positive way. Over the years, there's been like several versions of this in my head as I've grown and evolved and the world has evolved around me. And I got more liberal with my mental rewrites, cutting out a lot of the racism, sexism, really any other kind of ism. The beauty of being a cis white man in the loner genius trope is you just get away with stuff. And the show tends to frame his comments as ironic and harmless. Like, you kind of believe that he doesn't actually think the things he says, but he just likes to make people angry. And this is what I'd hoped for this episode. I hoped his comments would be framed as not super serious, that they were just to get a rise out of somebody. I wanted to believe that his disbelief in this orientation was focused on this one patient. This is a man who is a staunch atheist and has read the Bible, the Quran, and I'm pretty sure the Torah. He's a man who's open to new information and strives for accuracy. So he had to just have an issue with this particular patient. I was wrong. House's best friend Wilson gets a female patient who is asexual. Tells House, who's immediately intrigued, and tries to make a $100 bet, claiming that he can disprove this woman's sexuality. Wilson is reluctant to do so, but caves fairly quickly, citing the one rule is he's not allowed to talk to the patient. So he gives House access to this woman's file, and they go on their merry way. When running tests, his female co-workers that he works with cite she has no hormone deficiency, which is a common test run on people who identify as asexual, sometimes through coercion, and sometimes they just don't have the language to talk about what they're going through, and they'll accept the test. This woman, however, is being tested against her will and not with her knowledge, and for a petty reason as well. House spouts the common rhetoric against asexuality. It's the fundamental drive of our species. Sex is healthy. Both women suggest either physical injury or psychological issues. Other common assumptions made about people who identify as asexual. However, one of the employees, Adams, suggests that this woman might be happier without sex, saying that she misses out on some of the insecurities that can come with it, and she's immune to most advertising.
Eliminates most of her insecurities. She's immune to most advertising.
True. And claims that she can have honest relationships with men. House responds.
Not a lot of them.
Also true. She still states that she really seems not interested, and maybe he just needs to accept that her sexuality is real. He responds again.
People don't have sex. The only people who don't want it are either sick, dead, or lying.
That is by far the worst thing he could have said. That is no longer an individually focused take. That is a blanket statement. House, finding nothing wrong with the wife, starts investigating the husband instead, who also identifies as asexual, which still goes within the parameters of not talking to the original patient, and she brings in the husband under false pretenses to run tests. He thinks that the medical issue might not lie with the wife, but with the husband. The husband is diagnosed with a tumor near his pituitary that causes erectile dysfunction and lower libido. With medication, the problem can be solved. Wilson is upset by this, saying it's going to completely destroy this man's idea of himself. House jokingly suggests not telling the patient, even though the tumor would actually be deadly if left untreated. Wilson gets irritated again because of House's meddling, but then House points out that he only brought this up to him in the first place because he knew it was something he'd be interested in, and he knew he would try to meddle, which means secretly Wilson did not believe her either. Wilson tells the couple about the tumor and tells the man that he may start to experience arousal. He immediately panics, says he does not want the treatment, and he says he knows who he is. The wife says that they'll adjust, and that actually she has had sex before, and she lied about her identity because she gave it up to marry him. She reveals that she does not in fact identify as asexual. Do not pass go. House collects $100. Wilson is one of the characters besides Adams who I will give some props to, because he seems to be the only person who did any kind of surface level research on the orientation at all. He even mentions the statistic of 1% of the population being asexual, and even says the words, "It's a legitimate sexual orientation." However, after House proves him wrong, he quickly caves to his point of view, and then, it all falls apart. Even saying, "We disproved asexuality." which is far from the truth. They get a lot wrong. Asexuality is the absence of sexual attraction, not sexual arousal. There are many shades of this under the ace umbrella. Some aces are sex repulsed, which I'd go so far to say this man is.
Okay, look, I know who I am, okay? And I'm not one of them.
Hey, look, we'll adjust. Okay? We can go through this together.
You mean have sex? I can't make you do that.
Maybe it won't be so bad.
It'll be terrible.
Considering when the idea of him being aroused is presented to him, he says it will be horrible, which means even if he does gain his libido back, he may still not want to do the act. Some people have urges, they're just not directed towards anybody, and some people will just take care of it themselves or wait for it to pass. He's in a committed relationship because he's romantically attracted to his wife. He loves her. That doesn't have to be entangled with sex. His wife is obviously romantically and sexually attracted to him, and she even gave up something that a lot of people consider really important to be with him. She supported his identity, and it's actually a real relationship scenario to some people on the ace spectrum. And other asexuals will sometimes choose to have sex with their allosexual partners because it's something they want to give them and it's right for their relationship. In my utopian rewrite of this show, considering it's this episode's C plot, like it's like 4 scenes out of a 45-minute episode, I would cut it entirely. Like, you do not lose any substance of the episode if you cut this plot. Like, you could do the show exactly the same without it, and it would have been fine. As much as I want ace rep on television, I don't think this is the place for it. It's just not a place where it could be explored in a proper and respectful way. That being said, in my video where I came out as ace, the focus was on relationships, specifically relationship hierarchy, and I lamented about how friendships are never going to be treated the same as romantic relationships. They will always be some step below, and they're just never going to be taken as seriously. And I also talked about my love for the House Wilson and Holmes Watson dynamic. Same difference. I described them as clingy, toxic besties. House is actually a loose Sherlock Holmes retelling. And I mean loose, but there's references. There's an episode where Wilson makes up a fake patient after House's team gets curious about a Christmas present he received that seemed like it came from a former lover. Wilson creates this whole story saying he had this patient, calling her Irene Adler, saying they had a thing back in the day. They obviously believe this, and then Wilson believes, actually, the present is from me like a year ago, and it was a book about Dr. Joseph Bell, who is the actual basis for Sherlock Holmes, and inside the book is inscribed, "Greg made me think of you."
Seems kind of gay.
Well, I appreciated Daniel's video on House, and I agreed with a lot of the points he made. I think it was safe to assume that he's not really a fan of the show, and that's totally valid. It is not everybody's cup of tea, and I totally understand that. So, with full respect for David's take, I'm taking it upon myself as a fan to point out some accidental representation that may not have been noticed. When I watched Daniel's video about queerness and aro aceness in Sherlock Holmes stories, it made me go back and think, what about the Holmes-Watson dynamic I found so compelling? I've read the fan fiction. Usually skipping past any sexy parts, actually sometimes it would kind of ruin it for me because I was never really interested in seeing them be physical. What really interested me was the constant choosing of one another. They're not related by blood, they're not romantically involved, yet they singularly choose each other and are important to each other in each other's lives as if they were.
Why not? Why not date you? It's brilliant. We've known each other for years. We've put up with all kinds of crap from each other, and we keep coming back. We're a couple.
Whether I realized it or not, House and Wilson was my first example of a queer platonic relationship. Major spoilers ahead. These two consistently come back together, again and again. They live together multiple times throughout the show, despite the fact that they're both department heads at a major hospital and can afford to not have to do that, and they even keep their separate apartments during their cohabitation. Obviously, money is not an issue here. They know each other inside and out. They can pick out each other's little quirks. They speak to each other in a way that is almost like code. Despite Wilson's many marriages, all of them fail, usually due to him spending way too much time with House, and despite House's worst behavior, he keeps coming back. And even when any kind of romance is like hinted at them or anyone suggests that it might be a thing, House doesn't even balk at it.
Everyone in our building thinks we're gay.
We're grown men over the age of 30 who moved in together. We're 2 tigers away from an act in Vegas.
It doesn't bother him at all. Sometimes he even plays into it.
What are you hiding?
I'm gay. Oh, that's not what you meant. It does explain a lot, though. No girlfriend, always with Wilson.
And spoilers ahead, in the second half of season 8, Wilson contracts a particularly aggressive form of cancer. House, being the person he is with no regard for ethics or medical rules, takes it upon himself to give Wilson an extreme dose of chemo in his own home. He stays and looks after him through this entire ordeal, through nausea, through sickness, through delirium. He is there like a parent or a lover or a spouse. In the end, it doesn't end up working. Wilson is given 6 months to live. And House, who had just come back from a stint in prison and was on parole, commits some property damage by accident and ends up being told he's gonna go back to prison. In House's finale, we see him supposedly perish in a burning building. This is the show's Reichenbach Fall moment. At his funeral, Wilson receives a mysterious text message and goes to his apartment. House is sitting on the doorstep, asking Wilson how he wants to spend his final months. The one thing he probably loved as much as Wilson was his job. He loved being a diagnostician and in his own way felt a profound calling to that profession.
You don't risk jail in your career to save somebody who doesn't want to be saved unless you got something, anything, one thing. The reason normal people got wives and kids and hobbies, whatever, that's because they ain't got that one thing that hits them that hard and that true. I got music, you got this. The thing you think about all the time, thing that keeps you south of normal.
And he treated it as such. And he gave up everything for this one man. People for years who have loved the House Wilson pairing have accused the show of queerbaiting, but there's still many avid fans who love these two, including me. And I credit the show for being one of the things that helped me through my bisexual, now biromantic awakening. Because at the time, I realized I loved a friend like that. Not in a physical way, and she didn't reciprocate, but we're still friends. Again, it wasn't a physical attraction. House has very few romantic entanglements throughout the run of the show. He's actually infamous for his lack of romantic entanglements. And a lot of it's due to his general attitude and what I believe to be neurodivergency, and it's also hinted at that due to his disability, he's kind of insecure in physical relationships, usually substituting hookers who seem to do anything but sex half the time.
Call an ambulance!
Why?
What do you mean, why? She's hurt!
She doesn't look hurt.
It'd still be possible.
House. She's clearly dead.
She was dead.
She wasn't dead. She wasn't even sick, you moron.
I'm someone with no romantic entanglements, but I've fixated on friends in very intense ways. It's not physical attraction, it's not romantic, but it's love. I place my friendships at that level of importance. I've had chemistry with people that has had nothing to do with sex. I've also had crushes that were fleeting, but my friendships are for the long term. Wilson is his only close relationship. Even when other people attempt to have a close relationship with House, he either is uninterested or sabotages it. No one matches up, and all of Wilson's marriages fail. Sometimes you never even see who he's married to, and the one wife you do meet cites House as a reason for the divorce. And the fact that these men are so devoted to each other in their middle age gives me hope for the future well past my 20s, that I might be able to achieve that at what people would call late in the game. I fixated on House for a lot of reasons. His lack of social skills, his impulsivity, his strive for accuracy, his melancholy that he couldn't seem to shake, and the calling that he felt was profound. These were the things I could relate to when I found it. Then he got more relatable. My day job is currently in retail. I do a lot of standing around, a lot of bending over, a lot of lifting, moving around very quickly for hours at a time. In the winter of 2020, I started to experience some severe back pain. And I mean so bad that I could not bend over and come back up without yelping involuntarily. I had to take time off work and try to get accommodation, which did not go well. Eventually the pain died down with heat and rest, but it never fully went away. The pain would sit on my right hand side and radiate down my right leg. Eventually I was diagnosed with a condition called sacral iliitis, which according to Google is an inflammation of one or both of your sacroiliac joints situated where your lower spine and pelvis connect. Sacroiliitis can cause pain in your buttocks or lower back and can extend down one or both legs. I did physical therapy and it helps a bit, but it's not going to go away. Lack of movement is bad for it. But sometimes the last thing I want to do is move. If I sit for too long, that can inflame it. A couple months ago, I was on a plane for 5 hours. By the end of it, my leg was screaming, and I've had flare-ups since. I've missed work, I've maxed out on ibuprofen, I've skipped appointments, and I'm still working on not feeling guilty about it. On bad pain days, I watch House because I at least know he's experiencing at least something similar to what I'm going through. And on his bad pain days, he can be rude, abrasive, and sometimes, rarely, downright cruel. When I was traveling for 5 hours a few months ago, I texted a friend at the airport. Something along the lines of, my right leg is killing me, I'm being such a bitch right now, no wonder House acted like this. I can be cynical, I've said terrible things, I have poor impulse control, I strive for accuracy, and I have something in my life that feels like a profound calling. And now my leg hurts. And I'm on the ACE spectrum. Reparative readings are about maximizing the good and imagining a utopian version of the media you consume. I like to think his opinion would evolve with the times, with new research, of which there was frighteningly little of in 2012. Again, he strives for accuracy. I like to think if the show were written today, the storyline would either be fixed or omitted entirely. So where do I land? Despite the show's poor representation of my identity, it also taught me a lot about my identity. It taught me how to be a person. And if in the future I am cast in a role like House, I would consider it a high achievement. One, because I think he's complex, and two, because I think it would mean female characters have evolved enough that you can have a female House and it won't be strange. And it would just be as compelling, even with modern changes. And to me, that's utopia.
On their behalf, to dedicate to me. Because well, without me, they're nothing. And I am truly fantastic and an honor to work with.